thank God. I wish I'd picked something else, but thank you for being here. So we're gonna kind of go deeper into like teaching around transition. And so we talked, my first part was just starting to have the conversation around climate change and teaching around climate change. But now kind of going into like, how do we have these conversations about transition? So again, can I just get a show of hands? Who is a teacher here in this room? One teacher. All right, you and me, we're going to be talking a lot.
Teacher in other capacities.
Okay, well that's good. That's good. Okay, so I'm going to just start off by saying I've been a teacher for 4 years now. Trained high school science, and then got offered an elementary job the week before school started in that first summer, and so decided I was going to take it, and now I don't think I'd go back to high school. I love elementary and the ability to weave issues like climate change into kind of everything that we do, so we can get a bigger, broader picture of the issue than we could in just like a science class. But so I'm going to admit to you right off the bat that I'm not an expert in teaching transition. This is, what I'm hoping to do is just kind of like start the conversation here with you and how we can move forward and what's going to, ideas that you can use in your classroom and that kind of thing. This is something that I'm still like grappling with. But anyways, we'll just get started. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I like this from Adrian's presentation yesterday. So I snapped it yesterday on my phone and I typed it in. So a just transition, let's all start at the same framework. What is a just transition? So it's a social justice framework for ensuring productive, equitable outcomes for workers in the shift to a zero carbon economy. So we're working on the idea already that climate change is real. Climate change is going to have major implications for us on the prairies globally, and we need to change our dependency on oil and gas, right, or on burning of fossil fuels. And so how can we do that in a way that takes care of people? So we're not just like causing the decimation of communities in Saskatchewan who are dependent currently on fossil fuels. So again, that's kind of what we're talking about. But why do we need to talk about that? Well, we have this. We have the IPCC warning that just came out October 8th that shows that we have 12 years to limit, to make significant cuts to greenhouse gas emissions, or else we risk facing huge catastrophe. I talked in my climate presentation earlier today about how we've lost 50% of the Great Barrier Reef in the last 2 years, so 2016, 2017. If we hit 2 degrees, or if we hit 1.5 degree warming, we're looking at a loss of 70% of coral reefs around the Earth. And if we hit 2 degrees, 99% of coral reefs are expected to go extinct. So, I mean, that to me is catastrophic. You think of like the tourism that goes into coral reefs, you think about the food that comes out of coral reefs, the whole ecosystems around coral reefs. Just that one piece alone will ripple through all sorts of things. So we have the impetus to change. Now, the question is transition being taught in Saskatchewan classrooms today? And the short answer is no. So Dr. Emily Eaton, who is one of our organizers here today at the University of Regina, did recently a study or a research project looking at teachers who are teaching in areas of climate change. So they're working with certain organizations to kind of teach climate change, but also teachers who are teaching climate change in communities where they're rural communities where there is a dependency on fossil fuel industries. So she talked to 21 teachers, she talked to 3 out of classroom educational employees, 2 administrators, and 3 representatives from one of those organizations. And what she found was that they're not teaching, no one's teaching transition. They're teaching climate change, but not around the big picture, how do we transition to a different economy? How do we transition to a zero carbon economy? And some of her findings were that most teachers are teaching about these topics in science, but they're not teaching about them in social studies, where this is kind of a bigger, where there's more opportunities to be diving into like the power and authority that oil and gas companies have through lobby and all of those kind of pieces, how they have power in their community. I mean, even just yesterday, talking to folks in conversation and talking about how, well, what if the oil and gas companies go, think of all the charity money that they give to communities and we lose all that. Well, that's part of their they do that so that they are intricate into communities, right? So that it does make our transition off of fossil fuels harder and that communities will be more resistant. Teachers are talking about solutions on an individual action. And so, oh, you can recycle. Oh, you can drive less. Oh, you can turn your lights off, whatever. But the idea that we need this bigger social change, that policy from all level of governments isn't in the solutions is a problem. Because we know now, we've been talking about climate change for like what, 40 years? Maybe longer?
30.
Okay. And
30,
so,
maybe longer
At
for
least,
some people.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And
in the 70s.
yeah, so we've had individual actions to try and make change, clearly has not worked. We are still burning more and more fossil fuels each year globally. And then teachers are also continuing narratives of issues around the base load. So we know that, oh, well, we can't transition to renewables because the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time, right? And there are issues associated with those power generations, but they're not insurmountable by any means. But that narrative continues to be a reason why we can't transition in classrooms. That Canada is a drop in the bucket compared to China, and that any education must be balanced. So we talked about like the brainwashing piece earlier in my talk on the last one. So we'll address some of these issues right off the bat. So this is the share of global carbon dioxide emissions from fuel combustion in 2015. Kind of gives you a breakdown. So yes, China has a big slice, and then the United States, India, Russia, and then you find us with our 2% of global emissions. So the first thing that I like to say when talking about this, well, China's got the big thing, they should be the ones doing it. So I start by saying, you know, that's true. However, where do we get all of our stuff? China. So we've exported our production, our manufacturing to China. So I would argue that a portion of China's emissions are actually our emissions because of the way we currently live. So China doesn't deserve the 28%. That's some of ours, that's some of theirs, that's some of everyone else's. The other point that I like to make is that if we don't do anything because we only produce 1.6%, well then Germany should do the same, and South Korea should do the same, and Iran should do the same, and Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, South Africa, United Kingdom, Australia, only 1%. Now all of a sudden, that's a quarter of global emissions. There's 19 countries here, 17 countries here, right here for a quarter of global emissions. There are 175 countries here.
Why don't we count Canada as the rest of the world and we look like a bigger slice of the pie?
Absolutely.
It might just be perception, right?
It could be. But so I would argue that each of these countries needs to do their part. The only people, like according to that logic, the only people who need to do anything are China, United States, India, and Russia maybe. And then everyone else can just like, well, we'll just wait till everyone else does their thing. So, anyways, we'll move on. There's also the argument that, well, it's cold here, so we need to burn lots of fossil fuels because it's cold. Well, per capita, we emit a lot of greenhouse gases compared to other countries, and compared to Canada. And again, with the cold, then we have to heat our house. I'm pretty sure it's cold in Denmark. And I'm pretty sure, where did it go? It's cold in Norway. And yet, so that argument doesn't really hold water. We can transition in a way and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And so one of the pieces that we need to think about is, again, with that individual, the individual actions. So if we look at where our emissions come from in Saskatchewan, we can see that minerals and mining is 31%, and this is from 2014. So it's gone up a bit. 21% transportation, electrical generation, agriculture, and 2.5 for residential. Okay? So if we all do everything in our house, we're gonna affect that and some of that and some of that. We still have this piece and this piece, right? And so this when we understand where our emissions come from as a province, we can identify where we need to make changes, right? Where are the big pieces of the pie where we need to become more efficient or phase certain things out? So, the curricular opportunities for teaching transition. There are, again, a lot of opportunities, and I haven't touched on all of them, but just giving you an idea for teachers. Resource and wealth and social studies in grade 6, dynamic relationships in grade 7, grade 8, I can't remember what PA stands for, and then resources and wealth in grade 9. So there's lots of opportunities where you could assess the impact of citizens' willingness and ability to actively engage in the Canadian political process. So looking at communities that are going to be affected by this and how are they responding, and kind of looking at it as a case study and what's happening, how has the government come in, and how is, and like actually looking at what's happening in Saskatchewan as how you teach it, right? One of my things that I love doing is like pulling up news articles on CBC or Global or whatever, and like reading through them with my class and then having conversation about like what's actually happening in this province right now or the world. And then I would challenge people to think cross-curricular, just like the climate change presentation, where you can talk about these things in language arts. You can talk about these things in all sorts of different areas. So, when teaching about transition, ideas to think about. Individual action won't beat climate change. We've been trying that narrative for a while and it just hasn't worked. So change must be policy driven by all layers of government and communities. We're starting with the assumption here that climate change is real and we need to act, so we must change. So one of the things that I think we need to do is demonstrate that the technology works, that we have everything that we need today to solve this, okay? And then I think you want to have the students imagine, like, this is about conversation, right? It doesn't have to be like, oh, they get this or they get that, but we start having the conversations in our classroom. If this is the reality of climate change and we need to do our part, how do we do that? And then let students begin to imagine what that looks like. And that it's not just doom and gloom, that there are positives, that we can have positive health outcomes. I think of like, if we shut down the coal power plant in Estevan, that's a lot of air pollution that we're taking out of the atmosphere right around that city. Thinking about jobs, the economy, our effect on climate change. And then remembering the 3Ds that Simon introduced us to yesterday around democracy, decolonization, and decarbonization. And the thing is, kids get it. Like I talked about before, kids can see that climate change is real if we show them the evidence. If we show them what's happening in the world, they see it. And they are feeling anxious about it. And so they feel like they don't have a voice, that, you know, grown-ups today are making these decisions for them, and they're just gonna have to deal with the consequences. Whereas a just transition gives students hope, and I think it gives everybody hope. It gives everybody a vision that we can now rally behind and move towards, instead of just being driven by fear, which I think is the narrative we're getting right now, right? Like, we can't possibly have a carbon tax, we can't possibly have action on climate change because it'll hurt the economy so much. It's like, okay, but we know climate change is gonna really hurt our economy and has been hurting our economy already, so how can we move to a better place? That vision is important. And so I wanna share an experience with you with my class. So this is really exciting to me. This is Cowess's renewable energy storage facility. This is the first of its kind in Canada, and it is like 3 miles away from us here on the edge of Regina, okay? So Cowessess First Nation had in 2012, they got a wind turbine. The wind turbine produces about 600 kilowatt hours of power. And then just this fall, they unveiled 400 kilowatt hours of solar panels. And so together they're producing a megawatt of power, which is really cool, all from renewables. Now the other interesting piece is that there's also lithium batteries here. And so now they can actually store the energy. And so the turbines are going, they're charging up the battery. When the wind stops blowing, the battery then can continue to put electricity onto the grid. And so now that base load issue can be dealt with a bit there, okay? So this was really exciting. This was actually, this is not like an opportunity that everyone will get, I understand, because this was the opening day and my class was actually shooting a mini documentary with a professional documentarian around solar opportunities in Saskatchewan. So my kids we learned about solar power. We visited this installation, and then the kids did some interviews with the documentarian, and that'll be coming out in the next week or two. But so I'm not saying like everyone's going to get this opportunity, but Cowessess is trying to set things up so that you can take classrooms out there. So if you are interested in taking your class out there, you just need, this is Jessica. She is the project director with Cowessess First Nation. You just need to contact Cowessess and say, hey, I'd love to take my class out to see it, and they will probably accommodate you. They're trying really hard to get an interpreter out there next summer so that classrooms could just, a whole bunch of classrooms could come and see it. So anyways, this was Jessica, she's project manager. Lionel is a band counselor. This is Dan from Sky Fire Solar, and then Anthony from the Saskatchewan Research Council. So we met with them and we saw all their panels and saw all the stuff. So 1,134 panels was really interesting for the kids to see. This is their wind turbine. It's a real big wind turbine. We actually got to go inside of it and look up into the wind turbine, which was really cool. These are the lithium batteries that the kids got to see. So it's quite interesting that, on the edge of Regina, the first of its kind solar wind battery facility is right here, being led by Cowessess First Nation.
Do you know for the lithium batteries if they have to heat them or what they're doing for winterizing?
I don't know, but it will work during the winter. I'm not sure. My group, we split into two groups, and was not part of this group here. We didn't get the same description on the batteries as the other group did, so I can't answer that question.
Don't lithium batteries heat up when you put electricity through them?
They do, but I have like a lithium battery car and a lithium battery bike, and below -3 they start to experience losses in performance, and I've read at about -17 it stops the chemical reaction, so you have to externally heat them.
I'm guessing they would have heating in there.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's natural gas heating or if they're using the electricity, they generate the heat as well.
Is this all at one site? Because there's a whole bunch of other turbines. I only saw one turbine out at
There's only
Cowessess.
one turbine at Cowessess.
But the frame
The
before
next
this
picture.
showed a bunch of turbines
The next one.
backwards.
The next
Oh,
picture you
okay,
showed.
yes, that is not at Cowessess.
Yeah.
That is in, well, let's find out.
Is that,
This was in Portugal.
oh,
So the other piece of talking about transition is that countries are doing this already. So there are examples that we could use as case studies to look at where they're getting their electricity from and renewables. How have they been able to make this happen? So the idea that this isn't possible, well, that argument isn't true, right? So we can look at other places around the globe. Denmark here got 43% of its entire year power supply from wind in 2017. And then I showed this one earlier today. For the entire month of June, Scotland got 100% of its wind electricity got 100% of its electricity from wind. So again, there's neat opportunity to show kids that it's possible, like other places are doing this. So that's one of the pieces that you can teach around climate. The share of Germany's electricity from renewables peaked at 85% in this year. So again, there are examples across the globe. Now the other piece that we can talk about is there precedent for this kind of a shift, this kind of a transition. And there is, which is kind of cool. So in 1980, AT&T commissioned a study to forecast cell phone use by the year 2000. They projected 900,000 users. Well, the actual figure was 109 million. They were off by 120 times. Okay, so why did that happen? Well, there's now 8.5 billion cell phones in the world, which is nuts. So we clearly have adopted this technology very, very rapidly. And so the reasons this happened was the cost dropped sharply, the quality improved, and the low-income nations with no landline grids leapfrogged the old technology. Okay, so these were the pieces that led that to happen. And if we look at the subscriptions, here's the developing countries where we have landlines, right? So there's some uptake, but it's the developing nations who don't have phones already, and it just takes off. So this is the same kind of thing that we can see in developing nations today around solar and wind and those kind of things. This is the electrical system in Lagos, Nigeria.
That's a system.
Yeah. Versus this piece, right, where this, again, I talked about this morning, but this grass hut in South Sudan has probably never had electricity before, but now they can access that, right? This is in Sierra Leone, where they have solar-powered laptops. And I talked about this morning. China installed 53 gigawatts of solar in 2017. And so that's more than any other country in the world. And just to put that in perspective, we produce 3,500 megawatts of power, right, in the province of Saskatchewan. And so that's 15 times what we produce in a year with our current system. They put in 1 year. Here's the largest solar array in the world in China. So there's lots of opportunities to show students and have them like really look at, there are examples across the globe already that are showing we can do this. Here's India. Did you see Ella out there? Okay.
So I got a question on
Yes.
on the solar panel thing here, because I'd be surprised if that didn't come up from students. Is the use of fertile lands for solar panel installations as opposed to rooftops?
So, yeah, no, it's definitely, I'm not in favor of putting them on like arable land or anything like that.
Yeah.
There is lots of areas in the city, I think like parking lots, where we can put them over top or on buildings or that kind of thing. So, yeah, I'm not sure how like arable this land is here in China and India, right? And so like this could possibly be desert, but I 100% agree with you, and that we should not be using arable farmland in this province to be putting solar on.
I'm just
That
sure- I'm
Chinese
sure some
one
keeners
was
are
in
gonna
the
ask that
desert.
question.
Very good. Yeah, John?
Well, the other thing that came up in Saskatchewan was, they were talking about putting wind turbines in an area that was on native grasslands right next to the Chaplin Lake, and it's a migratory bird pathway, and people wrote letters in, and that project got moved to further south where it still will have some impact. But the result was that Saskatchewan developed guidelines for siting wind energy projects, and that's actually the first in Canada to have guidelines. So for once, we're ahead. And I know public pastures, public interest, we were involved in encouraging people to write in about it, and subsequently we've been invited to meet with wind energy companies. So it's, it's good to say wind energy, but you have to realize the side effects of things and work to counteract or mediate those side effects. Because if you get a little bit of side effect, people that want to deny any progress will point to that.
Yeah.
And I mean, it is real, some birds will get killed, but then you're trading that off to how many birds are gonna get killed by climate change.
Yeah.
Or cats.
Yes, yeah, or cats. I don't wanna start that conversation.
No, it's okay.
Um,
I have 2 cats.
There are certainly, we're always,
I got twice as many.
we're always gonna have impacts to when we're producing power. One of the interesting things that I just learned is that on solar panels, they're now realizing that for the polarization of light on the panels is detrimental for some insect species, specifically water aquatic insect species. So they, because of how the sun reflects off of the panels, the bugs think it's water, and so are trying to land on the panels and then getting disoriented and then like possibly dying and that kind of thing. So that can be easily mitigated by putting a film that kind of depolarizes it, which doesn't affect the efficacy of the panel. But I mean, the other piece on the wind turbines is we talk about bats, right? And there's
Yeah.
the easiest way to mitigate that is you increase the wind speed that the turbines turn on at. So bats don't migrate at wind speeds above, it was something really quite low. And so if the wind turbines don't actually kick in until that speed, then you don't kill as many bats. So there are easy solutions, like you say, we have the guidelines, which are only guidelines. We have to make sure that they actually get implemented, right? But yes, there are always impacts to it. But also looking at the energy or the job factor, the economy factor. So this is for this year in the U.S. Solar jobs are growing 9 times faster than the overall economy, and then solar installer is forecast to be the fastest growing job category in the U.S. through 2026, and wind turbine service technician is second. So again, showing kids that there are alternatives, that there is still opportunity, that moving on climate change doesn't mean that we just destroy all job opportunities, right? So some ideas for teaching, I was thinking about like a writing assignment, imagining the future. So what could Saskatchewan look like? Get your students to really like ponder that and do some writing around that. You could do a case study of examples of success, so like Cowessess First Nations. I thought it would be really interesting to do a role-playing scenario. So like actually taking like the real data and putting them in like a town like Estevan, where 15% of your workforce works directly in the coal mining or the power plant, and having different people play certain roles, and how do we come up with a plan? How do we find consensus? And so they can start to practice having those conversations around like, okay, I understand that your family is dependent on mining coal. How do we make this work for our community? And so that we're not just hurting people. Skyping an expert, talking to like Hadrian or Emily Eaton on Skype. You can bring in people if you don't feel like you have the expertise. And another piece I thought would be interesting to engage like bigger pieces, which some teachers might feel daunting, but doing like parent or community member interviews where you can pose some of these questions. So if climate change is real and we need to change our economy, what do you need? Or what do you want our next economy to look like? Or how do we move and giving people opportunity to have those ideas kind of come out would be an interesting opportunity. You might get kickback with that one because people are like, what the heck are you teaching in those classrooms, right? But this is just about conversation and providing those skills, right? So, I'm gonna pose some questions to you guys. What time are we at, Kristen? Or anyone else?
1:42.
1:42, okay, we got some time then. What other ideas do you have to teach transition? What barriers do you see in teaching transition? And what resources do you need as a teacher? I know we only got like a couple teachers in here, but anyone other ideas you have for teaching transition? See, I'm not an expert. I'm really wrapping my head around this at the same time, but I think it's something we need to be talking about and thinking about in our classrooms.
I was in a conversation a week or so ago with someone who was concerned about childhood and youth depression
Depression, yeah.
depression resulting from knowing about, or that they believe was resulting from knowing about climate change and this sort of thing. And she was asking about what kind of resources there were for that. And it occurs to me that your desire to tell, you know, young people about transitions and about alternatives might be the best therapy for that, or more of a preventive measure, you know, of avoiding the tendency for young people to become a bit overwhelmed by all the bad news. You know,
I certainly agree. I think talking about transition and thinking about transition gives people hope, whether you're young or old. We can problem solve this, and we can come up with a plan that gets us out of this mess, hopefully, right? But that's a lot better than being like, well, climate change is happening, good luck with your future, right? Or like, we're all gonna die because this is, we're not all gonna die, don't worry, Nate. So one of my students here, he's doing a youth perspective speech this afternoon, right after this session. But you know what I mean? Like, absolutely, Dave, I hear what you're saying, and I think talking about transition is, you know, we can talk about the threats, we can talk about the implications, but here's how we're gonna get around it, and we can rally behind that vision and idea. But I think the anxiety, depression issue is certainly an issue amongst young people.
More on that subject, CBC Sunday afternoon last weekend had climate change as the topic, and they were talking, one subject was about a hip hop artist that sings about climate change and teaching it.
Oh, yeah.
And but what made me think of that was about the depression aspect that can come from it. And there's actually people studying climate grief, I think they called it. And I didn't hear too many details about it, but basically about we have ceremonies to process the loss of loved ones, but we don't have ceremonies to process the loss of the rhinoceros that's gone extinct. And if that's important to people, which I think it is, then we're grieving that sort of loss, but without maybe the community support that we would get from losing a loved one.
Yeah, and I think it's called ecological grief. And I've actually talked, Dr. Catherine Arbuthnot is a conservation psychologist at the University of Regina, and I've actually talked to her on my radio show about it. And it's very interesting. She says that we don't have very good grieving rituals in any capacity in our society, Western Canadian society. We have some, but they don't actually like address issues. And so, yes, people are feeling great loss around climate